We're going to start now the new cycle with Luciano Perondi, who doesn't want to be called information designer. He'll explain briefly why in a moment. But he is a designer who designs information and typography with a research approach, which is what really makes his path quite interesting. He's also the director of ISIA in Urbino. He is the author of important typographical types, like the one commissioned by the newspaper Sole 24 Ore, and among very other things, he also taught in this school in the past. He isn't anymore because now he is busier in Urbino. But we really wanted to have his presence this year, and this is why we get to the title of the conference, the way in which he has brought the teaching of information design in this school and in other schools he works in is to do exactly with the overcoming of this term, of which he would explain the limits, to go towards something that Luciano and other people who are in charge of this item call like Synsemia, which means elements of writing in the space. He will explain this, and he has written a book about this 3 years ago, which is called exactly Synsemia, Writing in Space. So what he'll do today is a panoramic, obviously, of only a part of all the elements that give us a wider idea of writing and how you can project and design information, communication design. I hope to be up to this task, to this presentation. If there are any questions, please, at the end. Do you prefer them in the end, or actually no, he prefers them during the presentation. So if there's anything you want to ask and say, please say it during the presentation. For who doesn't speak Italian, she'll be here to translate the question, or you can even ask directly in English, and he will be perfectly able to understand you, as you prefer. Thanks, Luciano, and up to you. Hello, good evening. I will talk today about how in these years we have tried to approach this theme of writing and information design. In this work, I will also talk about things that I have also elaborated with other colleagues, Giovanni Russo, Antonio Perri and others. And last summer also with a group of, some people are here actually this evening in the workshop we did in Puglia. And I will also mention some things that a researcher of mine is working on, a student who is working on the relationship between photography and information design, which is a field which I think for different reasons, unfortunately, has been a bit not considered enough. Let's start from this term, Synsemia, which we can't translate, so we'll just say Synsemia, because it has been invented by Giovanni Russo in 2009. And in fact, it means the deliberate and conscious disposition of elements of writing in the space in order to communicate in a reasonably unambiguous way and in a regular fashion through the space articulation of elements. This is, the slides are both Italian and English, so it's clearer for everyone. This, I reckon, is a good example, a very significant example of what Synsemia can express, and what information design is about. If you observe this picture, there are lots of elements in it. The comprehension of these elements is dictated by its regularity, exactly. All these definitions that we give and all this work which we do on defining these words is connected then to the practice of designing. So these definitions have been created through our work, actually. So we have analyzed through the years how I was working and designing graphic elements and how other people were doing it, to have a wider reference on how we can work on these projects. So they're not definitions that can be completely universal, but they want to give a practical point of view on how we research and design. This is a magnetic photo, these police photos, and if you look here, you can see and you can find through some elements, there's a date, the time, so the PM, how tall he is, and all the other data elements about this person. This photo presents a situation in which many of you, quite quickly, through some regular elements which are consistent, can make this image understandable and unambiguous. It could even be a pretend image, a false. This is another example of Synsemia. This is a bill, a telephone bill. The mechanism is the same here. Just like in this case, we have typographical elements and also graphical elements that are connected to these. You see how the relation between the figure and the line, which indicates his height, is an information. In this case also we have elements that are connected through space to each other. And all these things you can understand either through a convention, a habitual use, or else you can make them unambiguous through their context. Let's look at this specifically. Regularity is exactly the key word to understand these. These regularities can be valid maybe only for a specific text, as long as it's coherent, rigorous, and can be interpreted without the aid of the author, or can be defined by specific patterns and habits of use. This is another police magnetic photo, and see how the elements that were used in the past to describe in detail the shape of the nose, the face, the eyes, and you can notice how all these elements are organized in space and somehow are connected and unambiguous in their interpretation, and they become meaningful also because of their spatial disposition. And a schema from the computer, an interface from the computer, is another example of how using regularities, regular norms, can be functional to the construction of a series of readable elements. This, for example, instead is an example. This is Stephen Harrison. It's the example of how you have the structure of a sentence, so internal justification. This shows you how a rule which was being introduced quite with no other reason and with no other instance anywhere else, if it's done regularly within the single text, can indicate something specific. In this case, for example, syntactic relations within a period. So coordinate clauses and subordinate clauses are indicated through this internal justification. If you do this regularly within a text, it's understandable even if you haven't ever seen it before, if it's the first time that it's been used. It's a process for which we deduct the result, even though it's the first time we see it. So we understand what the author was telling us. Here we have another example of regularity. It's not necessary to write that this is the year, this is the eclipse, and this is how long it lasts, for example. These elements, as they recur always in the same way, and this is the image of the moon covered by the shadow. We don't need to write this. It's inferred by the regularity with which it's being presented, by the graphic structure. I have specifically chosen to show you just examples that are a bit old-fashioned, let's say, a bit vintage, because actually the way in which writing is disposed in space, is organized in space and works, there are many things that are very interested also in the past, in the antique examples, and at the same time they can be completely not connected with the idea of the kind of language which we normally connect to information design, which is graphic, vectorial graphics. So I prefer to quote, to mention examples that illustrations of photos or incisions or other things that are not connected with graphic design. Why? And we also have, yes, we'll see also works of art, incisions, etches. Why don't I like the term information design? I'll explain now. I prefer to talk about writing and this word Synsemia that we've invented as a way of approaching writing, because the term information, as in its origin, the origin of the world, is very interesting. In Latin, the actual original meaning was to give shape to something. And in fact, information was to represent something or an idea. And this more philosophical meaning has then gradually changed towards the late antiquity in something which was nearer to juridical matters. So, informatore, the person who did information was the person who prepared the trial. During the Middle Ages, we gradually got to something that still meant a little bit giving shape, and then it also became to give certain directions or to give full details, so detailed information. And gradually, as we went on, the meaning of the word information has restricted to the most recent and quite direct and straightforward news that can be expressed through data, which really impoverishes and diminishes the variety and the multi-meaning of the writing. Even writing is a bit complicated. Well, scrittura in Italian has a wider meaning than writing actually in English, because in English writing is more the action, whereas in Italian writing is also, scrittura is also to compose in space and to use the words to mean something. This is an example of an Aztec text, the famous Mendoza Codex, which is a very late text, so already from an era after Columbus's discoveries, so after the conquer, let's say, of South America. So if you observe the elements within this picture, it's actually a text. It looks like an image to us, but it's written and described in a way which is quite clear, something that's happened, and it can be read like a text, it can be made vocal. All the elements that are held within this are actually pronounceable. An interesting item, for example, is the color. Each element within a text of this kind, an Aztec text or South American of that area, can be read. For example, color is read with an A prefix and means precious. If you find a green mountain, for example, this is a mountain, this is also a mountain, this is a curved mountain. Normally the mountain is colored in green. If you instead find a blue mountain, you read it differently and it means a precious mountain. So each element here, even this one that normally is brown, it indicates a particular moment. So the jubilee of the Aztecs of that moment. So when the cycles were renewed, there was a cycle of years that was completed. These are the years, and we start from naught again. And this is a kind of lighter which makes a lot of smoke and is pale blue because it's precious, that as well. Even all these characters that are drawn in white mean that they're nobles, for example. So they have a specific prefix before the name. You have the name, and this person will be called Tenoxin, for example, because he's very honorable, and then his name. And the fact that he's wearing white and wearing no shoes gives us this indication. Also their hairstyle, the ponytail, indicates that these were priests and the others were warriors. So this text can really be read with many information in it, in many directions. You can read it as the noble sitting down on the straw carpet, saying precious things surrounded by his warriors, and they're all their names. It's difficult now to say them all. All these elements are held and readable within this text by anyone who knows this particular code for writing, for expression. So there's a strong interaction with the specific language. The possibility of making these words combined together is connected to this particular kind of language. For example, another thing that is precious here is the smoke coming out of his mouth because he says precious things. So this is really writing, it all affects, it's a writing code. Another detail that we can see which is actually expressing some writing, these are specific warriors because there's their name written. These are the noble Aztec warriors because they have the specific elements of the warriors. But there's no name to them, so they're generalized. The Aztec code, or anyway of that area of America, even the ones that came before, were probably the only systems that have no distinction between drawings and writing. There's no distinction at all, so they can be a model in a way. They are a point of reference because they indicate the fact that it is actually possible to overcome this division, which I find completely artifact. It's something that it's cultural. I think it's completely possible that you can write by organizing elements in space without necessarily using a particular sequence unless you want to. They, for example, create a sequence with different elements. These are years, the years are in sequence. This starts here and finishes here, for example. So consider also how flexible this system is. Our systems can be also as flexible. This is a page of a famous Atlant, which in this page we see through Latin characters, of course, because Synsemia is not against the traditional Latin writing. The elements that can be perfectly integrated and that can be organized in space. This page for us is easier to read because it's closer to us culturally. Even though it's in German, we can read quite easily what it means. This page has the same characteristics, the same value, the same fashion and ability to mean something by organizing elements in space as the Aztec code we saw earlier. See? you can see how in this case we put different armies in different eras, Roman, Greek. It shows how they were put one against the other in different years. If you observe this, the mechanisms at the base of these two systems are quite similar or comparable. It's not a research of rules, it's a research of ways in which you can build a text. The harmony with which the soldiers are drawn in their dimensions is similar to the harmony that we find here, in which the men, also the warriors, have the same similar dimensions. The idea of how they are oriented to express a contraposition, for example, this is used in the same way. The idea of putting elements one next to the other, because through a spatial relation they acquire a meaning. For example, also the flexibility of the human figure, which can be dressed in different ways and have different suits of arms, or mean different things according to the shape or the clothing it acquires. This is the same also in this code. This is to show you how, not that our writing and Aztec codes are the same thing, but just to show you how there are some similarities, and they are quite meaningful similarities. They recur, and if you study them and analyze them, you can also use them to design and create something. And probably these have been used in studies to design through the centuries. Now I'm going to propose these 4 elements that we worked on last summer on this laboratory, which somehow managed to summarize the important things you need to do when you're building a systemic text. The first element is articulation and aggregation of elements. So to create elements that are connected and create homogeneous groups. For example, this is a book by this student of mine has found it, I don't know, in some bookshop, because she's doing a dissertation on photography. This idea that there are elements that are somehow connected. For example, all eyes, all heads. So these elements belong to the same group, they're on the same plan. In fact, when we have elements that are on the same plan, we can build some relations between them, and we can build other plans. So the idea to aggregate elements is the fundamental operation to be able to then build this kind of text. If you have any questions, please stop me at any moment, even while I'm speaking, okay? No, not for the moment. Okay. This is a very famous image by Flood. If you observe it, you can see that there are some coherent elements within it. There's some traced lines and other lines that are continuous. And they use the trace lines to express when you're passing on a plan. So the continuous ones represent things that exist, whereas the traced ones represent something that is in imagination. The groups that are made of similar elements are called aggregates. And this is the first step that normally we do to be able to build texts that have some sort of coherent meaning, consistent meaning. Another operation which is important is, for example, the periodic table of elements. Here the elements are chemical elements which are aggregated according to specific rules and divisions in groups of elements, the noble gases, the ions, the negatives, the positives, etc. So they are aggregated according to specific criteria, which obviously reflect on the graphic as well, on the graphic expression of them, the graphic rendition. If you observe, for example, this picture, this is a handbook for calligraphy. If you observe it, you can compare the elements because somehow they are aggregated. So the two arms are similar even though they're different. The texts have a similarity, have a connection. So one is good movement and the other one is bad movement. They're written in the same kind of character, type and style and dimension, and so on with all the details. Through this organization of space and aggregated elements and visual elements, it's possible to create correlations and links which allow us to understand and explain and elaborate the text. The second topic is exactly the one of visual variables. So once you have aggregates, you can start moving visual variables and reasoning upon them. Visual variables have been very well defined by Bertin in a very detailed way, and they have been different ideas of varying this structure, but Bertin's definition is actually quite synthetic and effective, even though they were dedicated only to a particular kind of graphic, which was cartography. But actually they give a very good idea also that can be applied also to other fields. If you look at this map of England, for example, made by Matthew Paris, you can see how in fact it applies very consistently all this idea of visual variables. For example, rivers are all done with the same graphic sign, which is a bit different from the sign used for the coasts. The main geographical areas, like Scotland, ultramarine Scotland, for example, is defined with these big capital letters. In the alternated colors, like, for example, here we have Cornwall done in the same graphic way, or else Wales. And so other geographical elements like cities maybe are surrounded by a circle. So it's all very consistent, and visually they are the same choices, the same guidelines. Each character has a different function. And so all the elements within here are strongly consistent and coherent. So even though Matthew Paris lived 800 years before Bertin, he actually, to build this geographic map, he actually used visual variables in a consistent and regular way. So it seems to me that this system is quite valuable to analyze also a Synsemic text and see where the strength of these spatial texts are, why some work and other ones don't. In fact, the visual consistency can also be found in texts that work more or less, and it becomes quite a determining factor, the visual consistency. So the coherence, for example, among these different visual elements which have a similar position and dimension. This is Peraldo, a knight. This is a kind of almost handbook for predication on ethics. And it uses a series of elements, also figurative elements, to illustrate, how can we say, these are clearly the capital vices, And these are the gifts by the Holy Ghost, and we have the blessings. So the use of his visual variables in space dimension allow to create a very strong relation between the capital Vice and one of the blessings or one of the gifts from the Holy Ghost. So these texts that work, in here there's a lot more than this. There's a very strong analogy in this area, but let's say it's a text that works, even if they're very antique texts, in fact had similar criteria to the ones that have then been defined by Bertin. Even though Bertin, probably he wouldn't be too happy of this application, maybe of the geographical map, yes, but not, it's not very statistic, certainly, that other image. The third element we can define as a hierarchical structure of elements. And that can be obtained again through visual elements, and it was again defined by Bertin, and specifically the hierarchic distance between these elements. This is a handbook to attack enemy airplanes during the Second World War, and you can see how some of the elements, through their spatial disposition, the size of the characters and the typographical choices, underline and make closer or distance more the elements composing this spatial text. For example, these two elements have the same size and they are related to each other. He's talking about two planes which, in the construction of the text, these two aeroplanes have the same role. If you read what it says, they really do have the same role. So the visual variables really respect and reflect the hierarchical disposition of these elements. This is the actual book. In this case, for example, was the map of philosophy, where there was a hierarchical distance created through the different levels of philosophy, and it is shown through spatial elements, but also the different dimensions and texture of the graphic elements. This is another example, even though it's a bit old now, a bit vintage compared to the cars we have now, with automatic driving. It depends what Volkswagen decides to do, but automatic cars now seem to be the trend. This is actually a competitor of Volkswagen. This was an example of how the same object with the same basic function can be redesigned. This is a dashboard of BMW M3, which can change according to how you prefer to drive. So you can give the kind of imposition that you choose, the configuration that you choose, depending on what you're more interested in. If you're more interested in speed or in other elements, or consumption of the car or whatever. This is to give you an idea what a hierarchical distance means. Bertin defines these as associative or dissociative variables. The more the variables are similar between each other, they create associations. So you have homogeneous groups. The more they differ, this is making it quite simple. I'm sorry, but otherwise it would become really too long to explain it in detail. The more instead the elements are distant, different, the more it means they create a difference and a distance between the elements. So for example, neither of these options is correct or wrong. In one case you are underlining the boundaries between different areas, in another one you are underlining overlapping. So hierarchical distances, independently from what kind of variables you're choosing, is really an element, a basic element to build a synsemic text. It's quite complex to understand what generates this hierarchical distance. We can say that maybe, for example, if I use a single spatial dimension or a single tone, if I use other characteristics like shape and texture and size, things become more complicated. So it's difficult to measure this hierarchical distance. We can approximate. The fourth element, it would be better defined rather than coordinated system as the systems of references. So it's not just the spatial coordinates, not just this is an example of geometric space coordinates, but we also mean, this is another example of the map of history, we also mean of a systems of reference that can be, for example, this. So this is a handbook made by a handbook to promote the idea of going to school, basically. And the system the reference here is the village and the home. Even though they're not spatial specific geometric coordinates, they allow you to put the elements in a context. So in this case, they become a system of reference. In fact, it actually plays on this. The comprehension of the message goes through a change in the system of reference. If you go to school, you can build a brick house rather than your hut you're living in. Basically, this is a message. A bit maybe old-fashioned as an example, but interesting. The same, also a face can be a system of references, because in this case, again, we have the handbook about interpreting faces from the point of view of police photographs. This system of reference of the face, within it has different kind of eyes and positioning of the nose. In this case, this is another, again, the handbook about air attack. In this case, the aeroplane becomes the system of reference. The actual shape of the aeroplane and all the elements that are defined there acquire their meaning through the fact of being connected with the aeroplane. So that's why the aeroplane is the reference. So these writings, these definitions have a meaning because of where they're positioned on the aeroplane. So if we reason about this reference system, aggregations and hierarchical distances, we can start already building some quite meaningful texts. This, for example, to make you understand how they're not just spatial coordinates, this is the famous London Underground map before it acquired the shape it has now. At the beginning, it had a more geographical distribution, more traditionally geographic. Nowadays, this is the current one. Apart from the presence of the River Thames, the reference is no more the geography of the actual city, but a series of geometric rules for which the map was built. So a series of distance between points, corners, 45-degree corners, and so geographical rules that have generated this map. So the system of reference has changed and has changed completely the map. So the reference system can also not be a series of coordinates, but it can be a group of rules that allow us to group anything. Like a periodic table of elements has the same base. If we change the reference system, it changes the result. This has been passed on to me by a friend that I hope to see this evening, but he's not here. This was made by a group of students with their teacher by using two different systems. In the outer part they have the geometrical rules, but inside they actually use a geographical reference, and so it gives more spatial coherence to the underground lines. I'm not saying that any of these ideas is better than the other. I'm just showing you how, by changing the reference system, we can change completely also the result and the functionality of the map. This map, for example, is more functional for the use of the space outside the underground rather than the traditional one. This one is more efficient and effective in terms of the readability, how it's easily read because it doesn't overlap. This is a different example again of how you can redesign the map of London. This is a time to travel, based on time to travel. This application shows you, starting from any stop of the underground, how long it takes to reach the other places. So the disposition of elements again changes completely. And this has another kind of functionality which depends on the new reference system that has been chosen. So the references can be more or less geometric and more or less based on rules, on composition rules. In the same way, this is an example of an Aztec test again, in which the reference system on the other way around is based on a system, and on that system they then crowd it with other elements which allow to complete this, let's say, chart, this scheme. It's a calendar actually, which also describes a sort of cosmography. So we have divinities of the Aztec pantheon with a series of symbolic and ritual elements connected to a particular direction, cardinal point or period of the year. These are days, exactly. It was this, all this was to explain how a reference system is a basic, fundamental element to be able to build any kind of synsemic text, any infographic which can actually work. If we forget this detail, we can really make some big mistakes. Of course, all this part is the part that we still haven't managed to systemize quite clearly. It's a bit incomplete. Another important aspect that concerns the writing of elements in space is the fact that writing is a series of clues which allow you to solve a problem in some way. This is a provocation also a bit, but actually we can look at writing in this way. Clues can be of two different kinds, procedural or structural. This is also a huge simplification, but you've got to be patient because we don't have enough time to go into detail. The procedural knowledge is the knowledge of an algorithm which allows you to obtain a result. So it's putting together all the operations that you need to do for solve a problem. So for example, if somebody asks you for directions, how do I get to the bread shop? You tell them go straight on, then right, then left. And what the left-hand girl is telling the right-hand girl is a series of procedures so an algorithm, a series of element she's got to follow to be able to reach the bread shop. If you skip just one element of the algorithm, you'll get lost. So the algorithm allows only one path. So this is a procedure. Instead, a structural knowledge is to know the relations between the elements that compose a problem. So if I know a place, I know the structure of the place, of the road, and I can find different solutions to my problem. My map, for example, can be a series of structural clues. To explain the difference, I want to give you this example from this book, which is called Information Design, exactly. You might have heard of it, read it, or seen it somewhere. The interesting thing is that these were experimental maps, tactile maps, and apart from the experiment itself about tactile maps, the interesting is the idea that there are two extremes in this. There's one side which has, one extreme which has more structural clues, so I'm not telling you where you need to go, but I'll just tell you how the structure of the place you're visiting is. The other extreme is procedural, and I'm going to tell you what you need to do to reach the particular place. Normally we have these clues living together. It's difficult to have one that is either completely procedural or completely structural. But this is an interesting aspect to analyze when you find yourself in the position of defining what kind of clues you want to give. For example, if I have to solve the problem of an emergency signaling on a place, structural element, the procedural clues are the quickest to do. Whereas if I want to introduce somebody to a city, somebody to live in a city, I'm going to give urban signposts, it's more important to give structural clues. So this is, you've got to choose what kind of clues you want to give. If the building that we're in now is difficult to orientate within it because you don't have points of reference and all floors look more or less the same, what you should do reason on is structural clues, which would allow me to understand maybe the structure or even redesign it some way. So giving clues that allow me to move around more easily. Another example is the genealogic tree is made basically on a procedural clue. This is this son, the son of this, the son of him, the son of him. Instead, a circle generation chart is something different. It does the same thing, the same information, so indicating whose son is who, but it's actually made in a structural way, so it gives more information about the structure of the family rather than the sequence of births. So the clues are more general and allow you to understand more clearly the relations, for example, among relatives. Instead, the indications we have on the right and on this picture as well, in Wainwright handbook you can find them, about the Lakeland Falls. They're still on the market, these books, obviously they're reproductions. They're called something like Pictorial Guide of the Lakeland Falls by Alfred Wainwright. I'll send you, maybe I can give you the information afterwards. They're extremely interested, all done by hand. I was mentioning this because we could speak for 2 hours just about this, because they're full of extremely interesting graphic solutions. He was a guide, he was not a graphic designer, but that makes it even more interesting. For example, here he expressed how you go from a plan to a higher plan. Here is showing the points in which you can be positioned, and you can see a series of peaks. These are procedural clues, for example. They're telling you, if you position yourself here and look in that direction, this is what you'll see. Let's say that on the practical point of view, what we can summarize now is that all these examples actually are part of a huge grouping, which is writing, which is what I'd rather define it as writing, which also includes information design. It also includes typography, alphabetical writing, all these sub-disciplines. But if we look at it all together as the act of writing, also composing a text, journalistic writing, narrative, or academic writing, they can all be seen together as part of a wider ensemble, which allows us to have less limits also to the solutions we can find. Normally we are quite kept tied up by the idea that there has to be a text and illustrated by images. Lots of images work as text, and lots of text can work as images. If we look at Marcatore's handbook about calligraphy, for example, it was writing, but it was also an image in a way. It was text and image together. So all the elements that are written also have an expressive feature, an expressive characteristic. There is no such thing as a neutral text. I have summarized the elements that a written text can contain in this chart. It can be more or less involving, so allowing the reader to get lost within this text and forget the fact that he's reading. So, for example, if I read an 1800s novel, or if I read a comic strip, I forget that I'm reading and I'm completely immersed in the reading. But if there's a handbook on informatic technology, I don't forget that I'm reading. Or it can have different degrees of abstraction, for example. So writings in alphabetical order of poems are completely abstractions. But at the same time, the police photos was a connection of abstract elements and also of actual visual analogic elements. If you consider this police photo, you can find them all together coherently, consistently connected, and there's no difference between the photography and the typography almost. A synoptic contents that the text can have. So the text is organized in space. A Tolstoy novel is not very synoptic, so you've got to read it in the correct order from the first line to the last. But a list or a telephone book or a geographical map is completely synoptic, but they're three texts. The same thing can be said about adherence to reasoning. Our reasoning is not necessarily always linear. We can also reason through images. I forgot to put some examples here, but you can also make some mathematical demonstration just by organizing elements in space and not necessarily. So sometimes our reasoning is spatial more than linear. So we need, maybe we impose ourselves a sequence for concentration purpose and to give for communication purposes, but our reasoning not necessarily is tied by this sequence. Another question is recursivity. So the fact that a text writing system, these are more elements that are connected. At the top half we have the text, and the bottom it's more about in general writing systems. So a writing system is recursive in the sense that it allows us to build sentences that are as long as we want. They can be any length. But within systems that are perfectly recursive, you can have also some systems that are more limited. This doesn't mean that the text will not work. For example, they can be systems that are more or less flexible. A system in which you write, for example, the musical notes on the way we write music is hardly flexible at all, not very flexible. Sorry, I don't know why it's turned off suddenly. So instead, the alphabet, even photography, are elements that are extremely flexible, and also consistency. This is to say, in general, that this is an example of text writing, high-level text. Who is able to read this kind of graphics can reasonably quickly and unambiguously understand what the author meant to say. It's not just a graphic, there are typographical elements, there are arrows. But it's not more strict or less strict than this text with by Jan Lenitzer about population explosion. Maybe somebody knows this text already. This is a comparison between quantities. It's a less complex context than the other one, but it's just as strict in its rules, even though it uses completely different means, expressive means. These two texts differ in the expression, but they are both texts that are reasonably understandable and unambiguous, consistent enough to be read by many people. Just like this, which is the same book by Jan Lenitzer, Population Explosion. You can find it. It's not been republished, but you can find the old version quite easily. It was quite widely diffused, yes. The element here is, what changes here is the expressive language, we could say, that is used in the two cases. But at the same time, the system still has some visual variables. It has a very clear and articulate reference system. It has a series of aggregated elements. The numbers are all the same size, so they are an aggregated element, for example. It works in a reasonably clear and effective way, even though it's just an illustration. Just like this handbook by Pierre Boucher on skiing, which is full of inconsistencies. I've discovered it's full of small mistakes in writing which don't allow us to comprehend as well as we could, but it's a very interesting experiment in the integration between, let's say, a constructivist typography and photography. So photography and typography used together to teach how to ski. So this puts together an element, a visual element, expressive visual element, which is very clear and very defined, with a function which is a function of a handbook. But not because it's expressive, it's less important as a handbook. Even this is expressive, but it's still graphic. And this graphic, this chart, is actually also expressive. Another example here, almost like a comic. This, for example, Gert Arends, is a picture. In this case, it's not an isotype, but if you look at the picture, you can understand quite clearly how even isotype, which can be considered as aseptic, is quite expressive. So not necessarily doesn't diminish its readability, its clarity. And the text can also be completely apparently aseptic, but at the same time it cannot communicate as much as this text does. So actually the important thing is that the information design is not a language, it's a way of building a text, and it's part of a much wider system which is represented by writing. This picture is, in a way, a written text. It can be read in a quite unambiguous way. It has evocative dimensions. These are part of the writing system. But it's not information design. So, in my opinion, this is why I think it's more correct to talk about writing, because to talk about information design has kind of crystallized a series of styles, of approaches, which are much more limited than something that concerns more generally a written text, and which can be approached only by overcoming the single disciplines, the single subjects. Now I've finished, so at least now, if you want normally at the end of my presentations I'm attacked. I hope you have at least some questions, maybe. Questions? We can, the microphone can reach you wherever you like. Do you have anything that in particular? There's so many stimulus that you were in this, and all of the slides could start a whole debate. I think it was all very clear in the ensemble. He can't teach you what you should be learning in a course, obviously. It's a series of ideas, of stimulus that you can bear in mind whenever you analyze an artifact that is trying to communicate something. And they're all elements that recently have been a bit overlooked, I think. The fact that every day we have such a huge number of charts, graphics, or other kinds of informations and visual products that try to communicate something, to communicate information to us, we are losing a little bit what the idea is of communication. We tend to think that information design is what has this history, was born in this particular moment, and so we think that this is information design. But we never completely doubt about what we instead look at and whether it communicates what it should be communicating. Is there anything that he's talked about today that you have maybe some curiosity about, that you'd like to ask about? Well, I'd like to ask a question then. Concerning, it might be a question that may require hours to answer, but concerning the huge production of so-called information design that we see every day, a colleague, somebody I know who's the art director in a magazine, told me that the editor of the same magazine often, while in the past he would have said, put an illustration, he says now, oh, let's put a nice infographic element, see what data we can put in. So an infographic now has become one of these objects that we can use, but not always we are communicating something. Sometimes we're just filling space. Do you think it would be possible to produce something for which users would be able to read these infographics so that they actually know how to read them and if they mean something? So do you think it's feasible to prepare an audience so that they know how to read these graphics? This is a general question. I'm not sure I can answer it very quickly, but I think that the main aim, I should say, of the design, but I think of all disciplines that are about knowledge, I think they should favor the access to knowledge. So with the means, with all the means we have, with no boundaries, and we shouldn't be saying this is journalism, this is an illustration, this is infographic. I think we should favor access to knowledge and the use, the awareness of using knowledge, which is really the central point. So I think any action we start, it's a bit of a general thing I'm saying, but whether we decide to put an infographic or illustration within an article, or whether we choose to approach a work in one way or another, any action we take, our main objective, or who is writing the text, or is working with us on the editing, or is producing something, I think we should always think that the aim is to guarantee the knowledge, the access to knowledge, and a conscious use of knowledge in general. I think whether it's a lawyer elaborating the license for a product, or whether it's a graphic designer, I think all our work is to form a community of people. The question was quite concrete, and maybe the answer is a bit abstract, but I think this is the main theme behind it all. I think it's necessary to design, produce, and work with this aim in mind. Then, whether it's always possible or not to obtain this is difficult to define, but anyhow, I think that all work of design and creativity should be thought this way. Then obviously it's extremely useful that we build more and more tools that allow people not only to understand the different kinds of language, of expressive languages, but also to produce them. So to develop the fact that we can now have all these softwares through which we can create charts and schemes. We have tools that are maybe limited but rigorous and strict enough to allow us to create something meaningful. I think this is really very important and useful. There are lots of tools now, I don't know if you know some of them. Crazy, do you know this tool? So I believe that if we are looking for an objective, this should be the objective, to allow people to access knowledge and to be able to use what they know consciously and with awareness. And a very, very abstract answer, I realize, sorry. Concerning what you were saying now, the fact that we have softwares that allow us to organize informations, don't you think now there's almost a risk of impoverishing and diminishing the expression which characterizes certain images, as we've seen in the case of the Aztecs, for example? There were some elements that really enriched the expressiveness of the image and made it belong to a certain period, a certain culture. Don't you think that now the fact that we have tools, technological tools, makes the path a little bit poorer? So maybe it makes the production a bit poorer. I can give two answers to this. First of all, I agree basically on the fact that third-degree curves have actually really killed a big part of the expressiveness that we could find. But on the other hand, informatic tools allow us to go beyond this. The contraposition, this is the second point I want to say, the key opposition is the two interfaces, the two tools we have that guide the user towards particular actions. and they are typically what you see is what you get, so you use it and get something. And so they're quite easy to use, but at the same time they limit you stylistically. If you use Illustrator, you do third-degree curves and you can't do much else. On the other side, we have the Wiggy Weave logic, which is a bit of a provocation, but I think it gives the idea, which means what you get is what you want. So you really get what you were looking for. Within this logic, for example, we can count tech, the language that is used for composing scientific text typography or metafont. These are professional tools. So the fact that you have the knowledge of these tools, thorough knowledge, allows you to overcome the limits that are posed by the informatic tool, because they allow you to reason on. The computer allows you to do all sorts of things, certainly. So to overcome the fact that you don't just use the basic curves. We have, for example, learned to create typographic elements through third-degree curves and making perfect shapes that are always the same. This was impossible to create in the past. By introducing, though, this regularity, we have created maybe an excessive regularity. So why don't we now that we have this and we have a higher resolution in screens, it would be interesting to introduce less regularity in the typographic elements. So, for example, it will make, so you can have a pseudo-random function for which you can simulate irregularity. And this irregularity, this is an example, can create a variation and a multiplicity that we would lose in normal by using in a very basic and passive way informatic tools. So this means that designers will more and more need to be able to understand these tools more thoroughly and know how to use them without forgetting all they knew before. So this to express again that the boundaries between disciplines are more and more mixed. You said at the beginning that you chose vintage examples. Which is the reason for this? I'm interested. The reason was a bit to escape as much as possible from this Bezier curve. So escape the idea, I didn't want to confuse in any way, or at least as possible, the expressive form given by the Bezier curve. So to escape that particular expressive shape and to go back to the roots of expressiveness, to show you how the roots of the so-called infographics are the same of photographic police photography, or that Matthew Paris used for his geographical maps, or Aztecs used for their codes. So it's to give you this idea that any graphic artifact now has its own expression, and this expression, however much cold it may seem, it isn't. And so somehow I wanted to put a distance take a distance from the most contemporary artifacts that sometimes are produced in the same way, even though this is not always true, obviously. We have tried some tryouts through Google's by writing on Google infographic with the student I was telling you who is working on this theme, and to see when we could find the first photographs within this research. Every now and then there was one, but 1 out of 20 maybe, 1 out of 50 or 100, depending on what kind of term we use together with infographic. The great majority of results were actually vectorial graphics. So to be able to tell you that information design is actually part of writing, it's not an invention that comes at the end of the 20th century, but we already had it in primitive times. I really had to show you vintage examples. I mean, the Middle Ages also. Cinema itself, I'm exaggerating now. Cinema, I think, is a form of writing. It's also a text, a film. It's a dynamic, interactive example. It's writing in space, etc. I always use extreme examples. I want to, and to make anti-technological examples, because I want to show you the origins. Davide will hate me for this. If there are no other questions, we'll thank again Luciano Perondi.